The Oregon woods held their breath that December morning, as if sensing the violence that winter was about to unleash. Henry Miller had felt it in his bones when he'd rolled out of his narrow bunk at dawn. That peculiar stillness that came before nature showed her teeth. 30 years of working these forests had taught him to read the signs, and every instinct screamed that today would be different. The chainsaw felt heavier than usual in his weathered hands as he made his way through the towering Douglas firs. At 52, Henry's body carried the accumulated weight of 3 decades spent among these giants, each ache a testament to trees felled and seasons endured. His breath formed small clouds in the frigid air, and he paused to pull his wool cap lower over graying temples. The silence was unnatural, no bird calls, no rustle of small creatures in the underbrush. Even the wind seemed to hold its tongue. Jake Morrison emerged from behind a massive cedar, his face flushed from exertion, and something else Henry recognized but never acknowledged aloud. The tremor in Jake's hands as he gripped his axe told the story of a man fighting battles on multiple fronts. At 45, Jake had been clean for 8 months, but the Oregon wilderness offered its own brand of temptation in the form of isolation and despair. "Storm's coming," Jake said, his voice carrying the rasp of too many cigarettes and too much whiskey in years past. "Can feel it in the air." Henry nodded, understanding passing between them in the way of men who'd learned to communicate in grunts and glances. They'd worked together for 5 years, but Henry knew as little about Jake's demons as Jake knew about the ghost that haunted Henry's cabin each night, the memory of Eleanor's laugh echoing in rooms that had grown too quiet. Tommy Chen appeared through the trees, moving with the quick efficiency that had made him invaluable despite his slight frame. At 28, he was the youngest of their informal crew, but his work ethic put men twice his age to shame. Every fallen tree brought him closer to his dream of bringing his wife and daughter from Guangzhou to join him in America. His English was careful, deliberate, each word chosen with the precision he brought to his axe work. "Sky looks angry," Tommy observed, tilting his head toward the canopy, where gray clouds gathered like mourners at a funeral. The first snowflakes began to fall as they worked, innocent enough at first, delicate crystals that melted on contact with their warm skin. But Henry had seen this before, the way nature could transform from beautiful to deadly in a matter of hours. He called out to old Pete, who worked alone deeper in the woods, preferring the company of trees to that of men. Pete emerged from the shadows like a phantom, his 67 years evident in the careful way he moved, but not in the strength of his grip or the sharpness of his pale blue eyes. Vietnam had left its mark on him in ways that went deeper than the scar that ran from his left temple to his jaw. For 20 years, he'd lived in a cabin 2 miles from civilization, speaking only when necessary, trusting no one completely. "We need to get to shelter," Henry announced, his voice carrying the authority of the eldest among them. "This isn't going to be a light dusting." As if summoned by his words, the wind picked up, sending the snowflakes swirling in chaotic patterns. The temperature dropped with alarming speed, and the men found themselves battling not just the elements, but the sudden urgency of survival. Their individual cabins were scattered across several miles of forest, each man having chosen isolation over community, solitude over the messiness of human connection. The snow began to fall harder, transforming the familiar landscape into something alien and threatening. Visibility dropped to mere yards, and the wind howled through the trees with a voice that spoke of winter's fury unleashed. Henry felt the first real stab of fear, not for himself, but for the realization that nature had just cut them off from the world beyond these woods. They were alone, truly alone, with nothing but each other and whatever strength they could muster against the storm that was about to test everything they thought they knew about survival. The storm hit with the fury of a wild animal, transforming the Oregon forest into a white maze of swirling snow and screaming wind. Henry's cabin, the largest and most central of their scattered dwellings, became their unwitting sanctuary. The 4 men huddled inside, their wet boots steaming near the wood stove. the silence between them as thick as the storm outside. Henry stared out the frosted window, watching the world disappear beneath layers of white. The snow fell so heavily that the trees beyond his porch had become ghostly shadows, their familiar shapes transformed into something alien and threatening. He'd lived through bad storms before, but this felt different, angrier, more personal. The wind rattled the cabin's walls with a violence that made him question the strength of logs he'd cut and fitted himself 15 years ago. Jake sat at the rough wooden table, his hands wrapped around a cup of black coffee that had long since gone cold. The tremor in his fingers had worsened since they'd taken shelter, and Henry could see him fighting the urge to reach for the flask he kept hidden in his coat pocket. The storms inside Jake's head were often fiercer than anything nature could conjure, and Henry wondered if this blizzard would be the breaking point. Tommy paced near the window, his usual calm efficiency replaced by restless energy. Every few minutes he'd check his watch, calculating the time difference between Oregon and Guangzhou, imagining his wife Lynn putting their daughter May to bed. The photograph in his wallet showed a little girl with pigtails and a gap-toothed smile, and Henry had caught him staring at it with an expression that spoke of homesickness so deep it might have been carved from his bones. Old Pete had claimed the corner farthest from the door, his back to the wall, a habit born from too many nights in Vietnamese jungles where the enemy could come from any direction. His pale eyes tracked every movement, every sound, as if the storm might be hiding threats more dangerous than wind and snow. Pete trusted the wilderness more than he trusted people, but even he seemed unsettled by the ferocity of nature's assault. The knock came at nearly midnight, so soft it might have been mistaken for a tree branch scraping against the cabin's exterior. Henry almost dismissed it, but the sound came again. 3 deliberate taps that couldn't be explained by wind or debris. The 4 men exchanged glances, each wondering if the storm had finally driven one of them to madness. Henry approached the door cautiously, his hand resting on the axe handle he kept mounted beside the frame. Through the small window, he could see nothing but swirling white, but the knocking persisted. Jake joined him, coffee forgotten, his body coiled with nervous energy. Tommy stopped pacing, and even Pete emerged from his corner, drawn by curiosity stronger than his need for defensive positioning. When Henry opened the door, the wind nearly tore it from his hands. Snow cascaded into the cabin, and for a moment he saw nothing but the storm's fury. Then she stepped into the light, a woman wrapped in a snow-covered coat, her dark hair plastered to her skull, her lips blue with cold. She carried a large pot in her arms, steam rising from beneath its lid despite the brutal temperature. "I'm sorry to bother you," she said, her voice steady despite the violent chattering of her teeth. "I saw your light and thought you might be hungry." The 4 men stared at her in stunned silence. Women were rare in this part of the forest, and strangers even rarer. The nearest town was 15 miles away, and the storm had made the roads impassable hours ago. Yet here she stood, as if she'd materialized from the blizzard itself, offering food to men who'd forgotten what it meant to be cared for. Henry found his voice first. "Come in, before you freeze to death." She stepped inside, shaking snow from her coat and looking around at the 4 faces watching her with expressions ranging from suspicion to bewilderment. "I'm Sarah Bennett," she said, setting the pot on the table. "I have a cabin about 3 miles north. I was making soup when the storm hit and realized I'd made enough for an army." The aroma that escaped when she lifted the lid was like nothing that had ever graced Henry's humble kitchen. Rich, complex, speaking of vegetables and herbs and care taken in preparation. It was the smell of home, of comfort, of all the things these 4 men had convinced themselves they no longer needed. "I don't mean to intrude," Sarah continued, studying their faces. "I just thought on a night like this, nobody should be alone." The silence that followed Sarah's words stretched like a taut wire ready to snap. 4 men who had perfected the art of emotional distance found themselves confronted by something they'd almost forgotten existed: genuine human kindness. Henry cleared his throat, the sound harsh in the suddenly charged atmosphere. "You walked 3 miles in this storm?" Jake's voice carried disbelief, mixed with something that might have been admiration. His hands had stopped trembling, as if Sarah's presence had somehow steadied the chaos inside him. Sarah unwrapped her scarf, revealing a face marked by laugh lines and crow's feet that spoke of someone who had smiled often, though her eyes held depths that suggested she understood suffering intimately. "I've walked through worse," she said simply, beginning to ladle soup into bowls Henry hadn't realized he'd retrieved from the cupboard. "Besides, I couldn't sleep knowing there were people out here facing this alone." Tommy approached the table cautiously, drawn by the steam rising from the bowls. "You live alone? 3 miles from here?" His careful English carried undertones of concern that transcended language barriers. "For the past 2 years," Sarah replied, handing him a bowl. "I'm a nurse, or was. I came here after—" She paused, stirring the soup with deliberate motions. "After I needed to find somewhere quiet to heal." Pete had remained in his corner, but Henry noticed how his pale eyes tracked Sarah's every movement, not with suspicion, but with the careful attention of someone trying to solve a puzzle. "What kind of nurse?" Pete asked, his voice rusty from disuse. "Emergency room, 20 years in Portland." Sarah's smile was warm, but tinged with sadness. "I've seen what storms can do to people, the physical ones and the emotional ones." The soup was unlike anything Henry had tasted in years. Rich broth filled with vegetables and herbs, but more than that, it tasted of care, of someone who had taken time to create something nourishing. As he ate, he found himself remembering Eleanor's cooking, how she'd hum while stirring pots, how the kitchen had been the heart of their home before cancer had stolen her voice forever. "This is wonderful," Tommy said, his usual reserve melting slightly. "My wife Lynn, she makes soup like this. Different ingredients, but same—" He searched for the word. "Same love." Sarah's eyes brightened. "You have a wife?" "Wife and daughter. In China still. I save money to bring them here." Tommy's voice grew stronger as he spoke of his family. "May is 6 now. She draws pictures, and Lynn sends them to me. I keep them here." He patted his shirt pocket where the photographs rested. "That must be hard," Sarah said, her voice gentle, "being so far from them." The acknowledgement broke something loose in Tommy's chest. "Very hard. Some days I think maybe I come here for nothing. Maybe I should go back. But you don't," Jake observed, speaking around a spoonful of soup. "You stay because you love them too much to give up." It was the most profound thing Henry had heard Jake say in 5 years of working together. The surprise on Jake's own face suggested he hadn't expected such insight from himself. Sarah turned to Jake with interest. "You understand about loving someone enough to endure hardship?" Jake's jaw tightened, and for a moment Henry thought he might retreat back into his shell. But something in Sarah's expression, non-judgmental, genuinely curious, seemed to unlock his tongue. "I had a family once. Wife, 2 kids. Lost them to my drinking." He stared into his soup as if it might hold absolution. "Not literally lost, but they're better off without me." "Are they?" Sarah asked quietly. "Or are you just telling yourself that to make the pain easier to bear?" The question hung in the air like smoke. Outside, the storm continued its assault, but inside the cabin, something had shifted. The walls that each man had built around his heart were showing cracks, and through those fissures, something long dormant was beginning to stir. Henry found himself watching Sarah with growing wonder. She wasn't pushing, wasn't prying, but somehow her presence was drawing out confessions that had been locked away for years. He wondered what sorrows had brought her to these woods, what storms she had weathered that made her so skilled at navigating the tempests in other people's souls. The fire crackled in the hearth, casting dancing shadows on the cabin walls as the storm raged with undiminished fury. Sarah had accepted Henry's offer of his bed while the men arranged themselves on the floor with sleeping bags and blankets. But sleep proved elusive for all of them. The presence of this unexpected guest stirring emotions that had been carefully buried for years. Henry lay on his back near the fire, staring at the ceiling beams he'd installed with his own hands. The sound of Sarah's gentle breathing from the bedroom reminded him of nights when Eleanor's presence had filled the darkness with warmth and comfort. He closed his eyes, allowing himself to remember what it felt like to share space with someone who cared, whether he lived or died. "Can't sleep either," Jake's whisper cut through the darkness. "No," Henry replied softly. "You? Keep thinking about what she said, about my kids." Jake's voice carried a tremor that had nothing to do with alcohol withdrawal. "Emma would be 16 now, Michael 14. I wonder if they even remember me." Tommy stirred on his makeshift bed near the window. "They remember," he said quietly. "Children always remember their father even when fathers think they forget." Pete's voice emerged from the shadows near the door. "Sometimes remembering is the hardest part." The four men had shared this cabin for hours, but this was the first time they'd truly spoken to each other. The storm had stripped away their usual defenses, and Sarah's presence had somehow made vulnerability safe. "I used to drink because I couldn't handle the noise," Jake continued, his words coming faster now, as if a dam had burst. "The crying, the chaos, the constant need to be responsible for other people's happiness. But the silence is worse. This silence where I don't know if they're okay, if they need me, if they'd even want me back." Henry turned toward Jake's voice in the darkness. "Eleanor used to say that guilt was just love with nowhere to go." "Your wife?" Tommy asked. 15 years ago. Cancer." Henry's voice caught slightly. "I took care of her for 2 years while she died, and I thought I was being strong. But after she was gone, I realized I'd been preparing for the wrong kind of survival. I knew how to live without her body, but I never learned how to live without her love." Pete shifted in his corner, and Henry could sense him wrestling with something. Finally, the older man spoke. "I came back from Vietnam believing I was broken, told myself I was protecting people by staying away from them. But maybe I was just protecting myself from caring about anyone enough to lose them again." Sarah appeared in the bedroom doorway, silhouetted against the dim light filtering through the frosted window. She moved quietly to the fire, wrapping a blanket around her shoulders. "I'm sorry," she said softly. "I didn't mean to eavesdrop, but I couldn't help hearing." "It's okay," Henry said, sitting up. "We're not saying anything we haven't thought 1,000 times." Sarah settled onto the floor beside them, joining their circle of shared darkness. "I lost my husband and daughter in a car accident 3 years ago," she said, her voice steady but full of pain. "I was supposed to be with them, but I got called in for an emergency surgery. I saved a stranger's life that night while my family died on a highway 20 miles away." The silence that followed was profound, weighted with the recognition of shared loss. Each of them had been running from something, seeking isolation as a balm for wounds that refused to heal. "I came to these woods because I thought I deserved to be alone," Sarah continued. "But tonight, walking through that storm to get here, I realized something. We can't heal in isolation. We need each other, even when we're convinced we don't deserve comfort." Outside, the wind howled with primal fury, but inside the cabin, something had fundamentally changed. 4 strangers had become something more, not quite friends, not yet family, but fellow travelers on a journey toward understanding that some storms can only be weathered together. Dawn brought no relief from the storm's fury. If anything, the wind had grown more vicious overnight, and the snow had piled so high against the cabin's windows that the interior felt like a cave. Henry woke to find Sarah already up, moving quietly around the kitchen area, her face pale and drawn. "You okay?" he asked, noting the way she gripped the counter for support. "Just tired," she said, but her breathing was shallow, labored. "The altitude here is different than I'm used to." Jake emerged from his sleeping bag, immediately alert to the strain in her voice. His years of battling his own demons had made him sensitive to others' struggles. "You don't look good. Maybe you should sit down." Sarah waved away their concern, but as she reached for the coffee pot, her knees buckled. Henry caught her before she hit the floor, her skin clammy and cold, despite the warmth from the fire. Tommy and Pete were instantly at her side, the crisis cutting through their individual defenses. "I'm fine," Sarah whispered, but her lips had taken on a bluish tinge that terrified Henry. "Just need a minute." "No, you're not fine," Pete said, his military training kicking in. "This looks like shock or hypothermia, maybe both." Jake was already pulling blankets from the bedroom, his hands steady for the first time in months. "We need to get her warm, elevate her feet." They worked together with an efficiency that surprised them all, each man contributing his particular skills to the crisis. Tommy built up the fire while Pete checked Sarah's pulse with the clinical precision of someone who'd seen too many medical emergencies in combat. Henry supported her weight, feeling how fragile she seemed despite the strength she'd shown the night before. "Her pulse is weak," Pete reported, his face grim, "and she's getting worse." Sarah tried to speak, but her words came out as mumbles. Her eyes fluttered closed, and Henry felt panic rise in his chest, the same helpless terror he'd experienced watching Eleanor slip away from him, despite all his efforts to save her. "We need to get her to a hospital," Tommy said, looking toward the door where snow had drifted nearly to the windows. "In this storm," Jake shook his head, "we'd never make it. Roads are impassable, and even if we could dig out, visibility is zero." Pete knelt beside Sarah, checking her breathing. "Then we treat her here. I've got some medical training from the army." "What do you need?" Henry asked, surprised by the strength in his own voice. For the next hour, they transformed into something none of them had expected: a team. Pete directed their efforts with quiet authority, drawing on battlefield medicine he'd hoped never to use again. Jake proved unexpectedly gentle, holding Sarah's hand and talking to her in soft, reassuring tones. Tommy used his mechanical skills to improve the cabin's heating, while Henry coordinated their efforts with the leadership that had made him the unofficial head of their loose crew. Sarah drifted in and out of consciousness, but during her lucid moments, she looked at each of them with an expression of wonder. "You're taking care of me," she whispered at one point, as if the concept was foreign to her. "Of course we are," Henry replied, smoothing her hair back from her forehead. "That's what people do." The words hung in the air, heavy with implication. When had any of them last taken care of another human being? When had they last allowed themselves to be needed? As the storm continued to rage outside, the five of them had become something unexpected, a family forged in crisis, bound together by the simple act of caring for one another when caring seemed impossible. 3 days later, the storm finally exhausted itself, leaving behind a world transformed by pristine white silence. Sarah had recovered slowly but steadily under their careful attention, and with her return to health came a shift in the dynamics between the five of them that none could have anticipated. Henry stood on his porch, breathing the crystalline air and marveling at how different everything looked. The familiar forest had become a wonderland of snow-laden branches and diamond-bright icicles, but more than the landscape had changed. The cabin behind him hummed with quiet conversation and the clink of dishes being washed, sounds that had been absent from his life for 15 years. Sarah emerged from the kitchen, moving carefully but with renewed strength. "The roads should be passable by tomorrow," she said, though her tone suggested no urgency to leave. "You're welcome to stay longer," Henry found himself saying, surprising them both, "until you're completely well." Pete appeared in the doorway carrying an armload of firewood he'd split with an energy that seemed to have returned from somewhere deep inside him. "We've been talking," he said, his usually gruff voice softer than Henry had ever heard it, "about what comes next." Jake joined them, his face clean-shaven for the first time since Henry had known him. "Sarah helped me write a letter," he said, holding up an envelope. "To Emma and Michael. I don't know if they'll want to see it, but I had to try." Tommy came out carrying his precious photographs, but instead of clutching them to his chest, he held them out for the others to see. "My family," he said proudly, "Lynn and May. I write to them today, tell them about new friends I make." Sarah looked around at the 4 men who had become so much more than strangers sharing shelter. "I came here believing I needed to punish myself by living alone," she said, "but maybe what I really needed was to remember that healing happens in community." Henry felt something shift in his chest, a loosening of grief that had calcified around his heart like scar tissue. "Eleanor would have liked you," he said to Sarah, and for the first time since his wife's death, the memory brought warmth instead of pain. "I think I would have liked her too," Sarah replied. They stood together on the porch, 5 people who had wandered separately into these woods, carrying their individual sorrows, now bound together by something stronger than their shared isolation. The storm had stripped away their defenses, but it had also revealed something they'd all forgotten, that humans were not meant to weather life's tempests alone. "So what now?" Jake asked, and Henry could hear hope creeping into his voice for the first time. Sarah smiled, and it transformed her entire face. "Now we make more soup, and we keep the door open for other travelers who might need a warm place to heal." Henry looked at his cabin, their cabin now, and saw not just logs and mortar, but a sanctuary. A place where broken people could find their way back to wholeness, where silence could be replaced by laughter, where the simple act of caring for one another could transform 4 isolated lives into something resembling a family. The Oregon woods stretched around them, no longer a place of exile, but of possibility. And in the distance, barely visible through the trees, smoke rose from other cabins, where other souls might be waiting for someone to knock on their door with a pot of soup and an invitation to remember what it meant to belong.